All right. Back to Jesus, first century rabbi. Jen got part of the way through chapter 2. And I'm going to take a little diversion for the first part of class this morning. Big surprise, right? I never do that. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about, first of all, about the sharing of stories between cultures and civilizations, because this is really more than just the sharing of Judaism and Christianity. There are examples, and I'm going to get into some of those this morning, where different cultures and different religions altogether, not of the Judeo-Christian heritage, have shared their stories, or they must have, because we have similar stories in our literature. And then the other thing that I wanted to do is, as we're getting into this book, for those of you that have a copy and are reading along, you'll notice some of the references that the author gives may seem a little strange. They're not references out of the New Testament or the Old Testament entirely. Some are, but some of the references are also from other Jewish literature. And the Jewish sacred literature is much more expansive than Christian sacred literature is, if we just take the canon of scripture at face value that we use, the Old and New Testament. So I wanted to go over that a little bit this morning so that we'll understand what the author is talking about and where he's getting these references from, because it's not all from the Torah, which is a very, very minuscule, very small part of the Jewish sacred literature. So we're going to do that this morning, and then we'll get on with chapter 2 and hopefully move through that fairly quickly. So, sharing ancient stories, Hebrew scripture and previous civilizations have stories that are in common. Some of these you will be familiar with. I think we've addressed them in other classes. Noah and the Great Flood is one. There are flood stories in multiple cultures, but most notably in ancient Sumeria and in ancient Babylonian, there are stories of great floods and heroes that build boats to save themselves and their families and so forth. So the Old Testament and other writings address that story. We have the story of Sargon of Akkad. Has anybody heard of Sargon of Akkad before? Probably not. Sargon of Akkad is an ancient Mesopotamian. So Mesopotamia is the area of the world that today we know as Iraq and maybe Iran. So this is a Mesopotamian tale of a baby that was hidden in a wicker basket many generations before the story of Moses would have ever been conceived of. And this baby was floated down the Euphrates River rather than the Nile River. So a couple of things in common there. And that was to avoid the baby, I guess, being taken by an evil king, who was the king of Cush, and the baby was raised in the land of Cush, became the cupbearer of the king, which is a responsibility in the court of some note, and later overthrew him, just as the Moses story kind of deals with the Egyptian pharaoh in a similar way. All right, then there is another story. Devices. What do you think that's meaning there, Jonathan? Is anybody on at home that can hear us? I just want to make sure. Yeah. Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
It could be louder if you can do anything on the mic.
Let me see. Maybe I can push it a little bit closer. And then looks like the microphone is turned all the way up. Is that okay where it's at now? Can you hear it?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right. So back to sharing stories. Oh, I got a slide ahead of myself now here. All right. All right. The righteous sufferer of Mesopotamia, that is similar to the book of Job. the main difference of that character is that God, at the end of the story, does not restore everything the way it was restored to Job. And he had, more children and more cattle and more money and more land than he ever had, in the first place. In the righteous sufferer of Mesopotamia, the hero of that story dies destitute. So at least in the book of Job, he got a blessing at the end, and it was ended a little bit more on a positive note. All right, then we have ancient Egyptian teachings that are similar to the wisdom literature that we just finished studying not too long ago, and I think this was mentioned in one of those classes. There are parts of 2 chapters in Proverbs that appear to be taken directly from an ancient Egyptian writing called the Instruction of Amenemope. And this was an ancient guide to living a good life. And we know that Proverbs is very similar, in its intent. There's lots of things that the writer of Proverbs tells us that if you do this, you're going to have a good life and you'll be successful. And so that does sound kind of similar to us. There's also something called the Prissy Papyrus. This is Egyptian writing that reflects on aging and loss of the senses with advice to the young to enjoy life while they can. And if you'll remember in Ecclesiastes, there's a passage similar to that. Enjoy it while you can because your hearing's going to go, your eyesight's going to go, and all of these things are going to happen. And your old age will probably not be anywhere near as fun as your youth. There are ancient Sumerian temple hymns that are very similar in style and structure to the Song of Songs. We studied that book. There's something called the Hymn to the Aten. That is an ancient Egyptian hymn that is written to a pharaoh, very similar in style and structure to Psalm 104. It doesn't say exactly the same thing word for word. I have a copy of the Hymn to the Aten. If anybody's interested, I'll be happy to email it to you, and you can look at Psalm 104. I was going to put some examples up there, but Psalm 104 is very lengthy, so we just spent the whole hour doing just that. But if you look at it, the way it's written is indeed there seems to be some commonality there. All right, so let's move ahead. Those are just examples of other cultures that have similar stories to Judaism and the Old Testament and Christianity. We're going to talk about the holy books of Judaism. The entire library of Jewish literature, which is, as I mentioned, far more extensive than our Bible, is called the Tanakh. And there's an acronym that is used for that, TNK. That's the Jewish Bible canon. And what I'm going to describe, hopefully I've got this correctly. If you know any more about this than I do, please.
I have one at home.
Yeah, feel free to speak up and correct me. But this is what I found in my research. So first of all, we have the Pentateuch, or the Torah. And this is what we hear of most often. This includes the creation story, the first 5 books of the Older Testament, as the author, I believe, calls it. The story of Abraham and Isaac, the story of Moses and the giving of the law, and then the record of all of that law. And then included in the Tanakh is also the prophets and other writings. The prophets is known as the Nevi'im. The writings are called Ketuvim, I guess in Hebrew. And these cover the stories of ancient Israel from the time that Moses led them into the land of promise, and then also the time after Israel or Judah returned from Babylon from the captivity in the 6th century AD, and then other things that happened after that going up into the Maccabean period. So those are the 3 main books of their Old Testament.
I will say, if you compare their Testament to our Old Testament, the books are in a different order, because for them it's in the Pentateuch, the prophets and the writings, where we had the Pentateuch, but then I don't know exactly how they determined the order of the rest of the books.
Yeah, okay.
Whether it had to do with time period or.
Could be. And the prophets would include all the ones that we're familiar with, Isaiah and Jeremiah and different.
And some of the lesser prophets.
Some of the lesser or minor prophets. And then what fills out the remainder of Jewish literature is the commentaries. And so there are lots of them. There's the Mishnah. This is an exegesis. Exegesis, you'll remember, means to extract. You're probably learning all about that in your
My whole class
in
is
your-
on exegesis.
exegesis. And so you're extracting information from the holy writings, and then the interpretation. What's the name for the interpretation, Coral?
I can't pronounce it.
Hermeneutics.
Hermeneutics.
So it's exegesis and hermeneutics of the Torah by a succession of laypersons and also clerical elites. This would be the rabbis that they did to help organize their system of beliefs. And the period of these writings of the Mishnah is primarily from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, which is right about the time that the book of Mark was being written, all the way up for 100 years or so into the 3rd century. A lot of that was arranged by a rabbi whose name was Judah Hanasi. He lived in the 2nd century CE, which was approximately the time that much of the New Testament was being written. So a lot of the later books of the New Testament after the writings of Paul and the Gospels were written in the 2nd century of the Common Era. The Mishnah, which is the oral law, means repetition or teaching. And you'll see these as you look through the references in your book that some of these orders and tractates are being referred to. There are 6 orders that are subdivided into tractates. There are 63 tractates subdivided into chapters. The chapters are subdivided into teachings. The teachings are what are called the Mishnah, or the plural is Mishnayot. And then the sages whose material is noted in the teachings are called the Tanaim, and they're also reflected just like we might write a technical paper and put references at the end of it, referencing who we're quoting or who made the statement. Those would be the kinds of things that were done to help remember who the sages were that first introduced different ideas. All right, then the Talmud. So with the advent of the Mishnah, a new class of rabbis known as the Amorim began to discuss and revise the documents to deal with contradictory material. This went on for about 3 centuries, from the 3rd to the 6th century CE, and this work was known as the Gemara. And the Gemara plus the Mishnah that we just previously described is what makes up the Talmud. Does that sound right to you, Coral?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about I don't know much about the Gemara.
Okay, it's the two works. It's
Yeah.
not just a single work. Talmud literally means the act of study, and the Talmud is written both in Hebrew and Aramaic. So if you wanted to be a scholar of Judaism and be able to read the Talmud, you would have to be able to read both Hebrew and Aramaic to make that happen.
I can only read the transliteration.
Me too. And barely that.
Yeah.
There's a Babylonian Talmud. It's almost 5,000 pages in length. You know, we Christians, we have to read the New Testament. We think, oh, that's too much work. Well, if you're going to be Jewish, you have to read a whole lot more and understand it, I guess. The Babylonian Talmud is mostly exegetical, so pulling the stories out, and interpretive hermeneutics, talking about the meaning of the stories. And then there's a Jerusalem Talmud, and that's more about legal and ethical issues. So this is what it looks like. And you can see that there are lots of additions. Probably, I'm guessing the center part is probably the original writing. And then each time another scholar comes along and has a different exegesis and interpretation of what has been said before, it would be written in the columns next to the center column. And you can see on one page there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about six or seven more comments that have fairly extensive comments that have been written on the left-hand side there. This is what an entire set of the Talmud looks like. It would be roughly equivalent, I think, to reading our Interpreter's Bible. Dennis has a copy of that. And that's what's sitting up on the bookshelf up there in the top left-hand corner. So the Interpreter's Bible would be similar to our Talmud, I think, in Christianity. Now, I'm going to see if I can expand this a little bit. I know it's a little hard to read, but you can see all of the arrows, the pink or purple arrows, and they point to the name of the person who made the comment and I guess the approximate time in which they lived. Or maybe those are pages, I'm not sure. Some of them are too long to be ages. But anyway, you can see what an arduous task it would be to be a scholar of the Talmud in Judaism. Anybody want to do that for our next book? I didn't think so. The first complete Talmud was, what's that?
Sounds like a good evening read.
Good evening read. Yeah. I'm sure it'd be good to help your sleep if you're having trouble sleeping at night. The first complete Talmud was printed in the 1500s. Actually, the printer was Daniel Bomberg, who was a Christian. It wasn't printed by a Jewish person. And the Talmud that he printed is the one that has existed basically in its same form for almost 500 years now till today. But there's more. We haven't even covered all of it yet. There are running commentaries on the Talmud itself, so now we have commentaries on the commentaries. That's known as the Midrash. The Midrash was written between the 10th and the 13th centuries, the Common Era. And the one rabbi who contributed greatly to the philosophies and understanding of those interpretations in the 12th century was a person by the name of Moses Maimonides. And he was the first one to write a comprehensive, it's outside, hopefully it's outside, a comprehensive commentary. Maimonides, and his nickname is Rambam. And you think, okay, that sounds like something out of the Jetsons, right? or the Flintstones, I don't know. That acronym comes from his Hebrew name, which was Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. Moshe is Moses, ben Maimon is son of Maimon. So his name was Moses, son of Maimon, and in the Greek, Maimonides. He was a very prolific writer and philosopher. He was born in Cordoba, Spain. His family had to leave when the Muslims, I guess, grew in strength, and they wanted all of the Jews to convert to Islam. And his family would not do that. They persisted in Spain for some 10 or 11 years, and finally, under pressure, decided that they needed to leave and return and go somewhere else. And so he lived for a while in Morocco and then in Egypt, and actually became the personal physician to Sultan Saladin, who obviously would have been a Muslim. So he was a very a man of the world, I guess. He wasn't limited to just his understanding of Jewish literature, but he spoke and wrote in Arabic. And he wrote a book called The Guide for the Perplexed. This was one of the great Jewish commentaries, and I love the title because, sometimes when we're trying to study scripture, it's very perplexing, and he was the first one to elaborate, I guess, on a lot of those things. But this is an English title page here, and it's hard to see, but it says right here, translated from the original Arabic text. And one of the wise things that Maimonides said was, you should listen to the truth, whoever may have said it. It's interesting. Sometimes my observation has been in the differences that we have in the world and between religions and between cultures and between countries. It's the academics that usually bridge the gaps there and are willing to talk to each other and learn from each other. And I suspect that's probably the pathway by which a lot of the ancient stories that have come down to handed down to us as scriptural, happen. The teachers, the learned, were the ones that were talking together while everybody else can't stand one another. But you often find that people who have an academic background are a little bit more tolerant, maybe, and willing to exchange ideas, which I think we should be thankful for.
Or they know they don't know the whole truth.
They don't know, they don't know the whole truth. That's absolutely right. I thought this was interesting. You could kind of see what you think about it, and we can talk about it for a minute if you want. This was a statement made by Maimonides on his view of God. God is a perfect unity, not admitting of any plurality. Now, this is the 12th century, so kind of think about, the state of belief at that time in the world and Christianity. God does not have parts, either literally or figuratively, no arms, no legs, no back or front, no end or no beginning.
No back or front.
What's that?
No back or front, she said.
No back or front. So what do you think? What is Maimonides saying here 800 years ago? 900 years ago.
Human,
Okay.
one.
I think he's also addressing the Trinity, the concept of Trinity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think God is being a perfect unity. He's probably somewhat quietly disagreeing with the need for.
Well, and the Quran basically says the same thing.
Yeah.
About, well, he didn't say it, but God doesn't have any helpers.
Yeah. And not looking at God in human form is a very non-theistic. I mean, our theistic view of God tends to be old man, white beard, flowing robes, sitting on a throne in heaven. We have
Pretty much goes along with the one God thing of, not a.
I'm not a what?
Not a Trinity.
Not a Trinity. Yeah, exactly.
Paul, this is a little conflict with
Go
me.
ahead.
As God created man in his own image, scripture. And I struggle with that a little bit.
Okay. That's a good point.
It makes it sound like God is a big misty cloud.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was gonna say ether.
Yeah.
I-
So, Paul, when you say non-theistic, does that mean you're deistic, or what are we calling it then?
Well, to me, theistic means that we believe in God as a personage, and that has, certainly been handed down to us in Community of Christ because of the experiences of Joseph Smith seeing Jesus and God together in one of his experiences as he reported it. And many people are very comfortable viewing God in that way, and I'm not disputing it. I'm just saying I think it's interesting that this long ago somebody was already thinking of God as more a consciousness or a universal presence that has no body, no beginning, no end. I mean, we certainly believe in God being the Alpha and the Omega, which literally means that, right?
Yeah.
Well, I will say that from the movie, Oh God, with George Burns and John Denver, he told John Denver that he appeared to him in a way that he could understand him and talked in a voice that he could understand.
It's the same way with Dogma. God shows up as a old man playing skee ball.
What was the name of that one?
Dogma.
Oh, Dogma. Okay.
Haven't heard
That's a
that.
movie?
Yeah.
I haven't seen
Yeah, he
Dogma.
plays
I
skee
don't
ball.
either.
Well, he plays people.
And then he changes into Alanis Morissette.
I remember the
Yeah.
Alanis Morissette part.
Well, and what was the other movie with Jim Carrey? Oh God, or no, it wasn't Oh God. That was
Bruce Almighty.
No.
Yeah,
Bruce
Bruce
Almighty,
Almighty.
yeah. So.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I didn't put this up here to question anybody's beliefs or change anybody's mind. This was just more interesting to me that so long ago we have somebody that was this far ahead, looking this far
It's a
ahead.
little bit of a Jewish perspective.
What's that?
It's a little bit of a Jewish
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah.
Uh-oh, not the rest.
So,
No.
that's yeah. So you can go down a lot of rabbit holes and studying Jewish literature, and we could spend a lot of time with this. This isn't even all of it. There's others.
With that, Coral.
Oh, I love rabbit holes.
Yeah. There's something called the Halakhic, which is the legal literature of Judaism. There's the Responsa. Maybe Jane can define common law for us, but the Responsa is questions from laypersons that the rabbis have interpreted according to the Mosaic law, their answers. So does that match with common law? I don't know what common law is.
I was laughing. You don't really want me to teach you common law.
Okay,
What
well-
was your definition?
Not my definition, but this writing, whatever it is that is called the responsa is, these are questions from laypersons to rabbis, and then the rabbis respond with their interpretation of the law. So whoever originated my information here called it a common law type of approach to the Mosaic law. There are
No.
prescriptive.
Her face is saying no.
Okay,
This isn't back there.
okay.
Yeah,
Well, I think maybe that's a term that's applied to this that doesn't really match up with how the legal system
if
views
a bunch
common
of
law.
rabbis got together and became judges and then created law in the form of cases for us to read, then yes.
Okay, so maybe that's what it was. Maybe, Paul, who's not a lawyer, would say, well, if I offend my neighbor, how long, do I have to serve time for doing that? And then the
you go to
rabbis would.
prescriptive legal code.
Yeah, then that's prescriptive legal codes, which we have those too. We hear about them all the time on TV when they talk about the amount of sentencing that a
Yes.
prisoner might expect to have based on the crime that they've committed.
But on the other hand, if you want an interpretation of the Constitution, you go to case law. The Supreme Court creates case law for all of us to follow. That's called common law.
Maybe, okay, interesting. Well, maybe that does have something in common then, or maybe that's more like
Yeah,
that.
it's more
the
of
halakhic.
interpretation.
And then on top of all the legal stuff, there's also mystical literature in Judaism, which I'm not going to deal with today. All right. So back to the book now. So we have an idea of what the author is drawing upon in terms of his premise that a lot of Christianity has been developed from writings, from Jewish writings. And so we kind of see how much background there is there. And in the book, he calls these echoes, oftentimes in the New Testament, Jesus or different ones would say, as it is written, and then they'll quote some piece of information from the Older Testament. And sometimes Jesus would say, okay, that's what the Old Testament says. What I say is this further interpretation of the law. And he did that with adultery. He said, you've heard it said that adultery is this, and I say that if a man looks on a woman to lust after her in the flesh, then even that, constitutes adultery. So they reach back into the Older Testament to draw on information that's presented in the Younger Testament. So how about birth stories? We already talked about one birth story from Mesopotamia. There is the stories of Moses and Jesus. Moses had to be protected from Pharaoh, and so his mother hid him in a wicker basket and set him afloat out in the Nile for the daughter of the Pharaoh to find. And Jesus had to be protected from Herod in the book of Matthew, and so the family, Joseph was contacted in a dream by an angel, said, get your family to Egypt, and so you can be protected from this wicked king. So Moses, Jesus both had that similar background. In the story of Moses, Miriam, who was Moses' sister, was kind of a mother figure who sort of kept watch over him from afar to make sure everything that was going okay. And then, of course, Jesus' name was Mary, and in the Hebrew, that is Miriam. So we have two Miriams. We have a Miriam involved in watching over Moses and a Miriam involved in watching over and raising Jesus. There are betrayal stories. Joseph, in the coat of many colors, was sold by his brothers for 20 pieces of silver into slavery. Jesus was sold by Judas for 30 pieces of silver. 1,500 years difference, probably inflation. Yeah, I'm guessing. Either inflation or maybe to show that Jesus was more important than Joseph was. The death stories of Moses and Jesus, both were taken up into heaven by God before their dreams saw fulfillment. This is the word of the authors. Dreams saw fulfillment. So Moses did not get to cross into the promised land. And of course, we would say that Christianity still had more work to do after Jesus left. So those are identified by our author as commonalities. We have God telling Moses to return to Egypt and take Israel with him. God tells Joseph to return to Judea, to Nazareth to raise Jesus when the time was right and when Herod had passed away. We have Joshua in the Older Testament, who was the warrior hero following Moses and leading the Israelites into Canaan, into their final promised land. We have Jesus, whose Hebrew name was Yeshua, or also Joshua of the Younger Testament, who was the spiritual hero of that writing. In the Old Testament, we have Moses appointing at God's command 70 helpers or elders that were appointed to help him. And in the New Testament, Jesus called other 70 to help spread the gospel. And that I think it's maybe in the book of Luke that takes place. And we have 70 today in our church as well. Oh yeah, Luke got it there. And then we have the betrayals. Judah was betrayed, the one who betrayed his brother Joseph into slavery. Judas was the one who betrayed Jesus. Both of those are taken from the Hebrew name Yehuda. So Judah and Judas are technically the same name. Judging from the humps, you didn't know that.
I didn't know that Miriam was like Mary.
Yeah. So it's, we're learning something here about the importance of language when we tell the scripture stories, right? There are miracle stories of Elijah, Elisha in the Old Testament, Older Testament, healing the sick, multiplying food, and raising the dead. So also with Jesus. Elijah was prophesied to be one who would return again to prepare the way of the Lord. The people asked John Baptist, are you Elijah or some other prophet that has come to proclaim the coming of God's kingdom?
And in the Seder meal, they always open the door to let Elijah come.
To let Elijah come back in. And that was important in the transfiguration as well, because Peter expected that Elijah would be returning at a certain time. The Tree of Life, we celebrated a Tree of Life service at the end of December, is mentioned both in Proverbs as well as in Revelation, so Older and Younger Testaments. Israel, or the church as God's bride, talked about both in the Old Testament book of Hosea and also in the book of Revelation. There are resurrection stories. Now, this one's a little bit of a stretch, but the author brings it up, and I'm going to assume that he is knowledgeable enough about this to be telling it truthfully. Some Jews will consider the story of Abraham and Isaac to be a resurrection story. And in the Midrash, there is writing that parallels the resurrection of Jesus in the story of Isaac being sacrificed by Abraham and then being resurrected again. So their interpretation of that is that as Abraham's knife was reaching for Isaac's neck, God began the process of removing the soul of Isaac. I mean, he was going to be dead in a second anyway. And so their interpretation is that even if only for a short instant, Isaac was dead to the world, had died. And then the angel of the Lord called out to Abraham, told him not to kill Isaac. And so Isaac's soul was returned to him. And that is interpreted by some rabbinic scholars as a resurrection story. Would you have ever? It reminds me of Schrodinger's cat. You know, the cat's in the box. We don't know if the cat's alive or the cat's dead. What were you going to say, Dennis?
So when was the Midrash stuff written?
That was the one that was written in the, I think, in the Middle Ages,
So
predominantly.
New Testament or the Younger Testament paralleling the Older Testament in this case.
Yeah, that's true. It's
sounds like the
paralleling.
Midrash is
Yeah, it's paralleling that.
Something that.
Yeah,
we see
okay.
about-
So, and that's going to come back to a point I'm going to make here in just a little bit about exchange the other way between
They don't have the
Christianity.
ram.
What's that?
They don't have the ram.
They don't have the ram? Oh, yeah,
It was sacrificed instead of Isaac.
right. So, to Dennis's point, to be fair, the author also acknowledges that while early Christian writings certainly borrowed stories from the Older Testament, the rabbinic writers were also influenced by Jesus' sayings and by Christian theology. And you may well be right on that. I don't think he alluded to that in the book, but it may be that because that was written later on, that was something that the rabbis had heard from Christianity and interpreted into their story.
I tried to figure out what midrash was, and I'm sorry I came late today, you might have already defined it, but that's what I think is more like common law. I think it's the rabbis getting together and everybody having some big discussions and then writing their interpretations down of what they thought the law was. And so, I mean, my understanding is that there's hundreds of these midrashes, you know, and so it's the Jewish religion kind of continuing to try to understand the Torah.
Yeah. So I went back to my slide just to be sure. The midrashes were written in the 10th to the 13th century. So
Okay.
you're absolutely
So not
Never said
anymore
that.
though. So they don't do it, they don't do it anymore.
Right,
I
yeah.
heard about that.
and Moses Maimonides was the one who primarily wrote, I guess, a lot
Okay.
of that. So yeah, good point.
One question about all these commentaries, though. Who decided which commentaries got in and which ones didn't?
I would imagine you probably, you know, to make an official entry in the Talmud, you probably had to be a rabbi of a certain amount, a certain standing, a certain scholarship, to be recognized as someone who,
Yeah.
you know, could faithfully represent Judaism and that.
But is the Talmud then a collection of these midrashes?
So the Talmud is the Mishnah, yes, the Mishnah and the Gemara. It was two.
That predates the Midrash.
Yeah, that predates it.
So
I think I
the
remember
Midrash
this
is a
stuff now.
commentary on the Talmud.
so much of it.
The midrash is a commentary.
Okay, so the
And the
Talmud, yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So the Mishnah, this is what we talked about earlier. The Mishnah is an exegesis and interpretation of the Torah by a succession of lay and clerical elites to organize Jewish beliefs. And that went on from the 2nd to the 3rd century CE that
And
much
that's,
of the Mishnah was written.
and that's just on the first 5 books of the Bible.
And then later on was the Gemara, and the Mishnah and the Gemara was what forms the Talmud.
Now, these two Talmuds, do some sects of Judaism accept one and others the other? Or
I don't know the answer to that.
Well, and I think Gamera was a rabbi. Was that
Which one?
Gamera? I think he was.
Oh, was he
it
the
might have
rabbi?
been a rabbinical school.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Gamera.
I know Gamaliel was a rabbi. You're
Yeah.
not thinking of him, are you?
No, I want to say something I read. I want to say that the Gamera might have been a rabbinical school.
We can do some more research on that this week. I didn't anticipate all the interest in this, but I'm certainly willing to go back and look up some more if I can. All right, so we have the author at least saying that there is exchanges taking both directions between Judaism and Christianity, again, probably being led primarily by the scholars like Moses Maimonides and perhaps others. This is just a list of topics. I don't plan to really spend time on it. Some of it we've addressed before. We've talked about the golden rule being present in many different cultures in some form. But certainly between Judaism and Christianity, beliefs about pride, how to handle adversaries and enemies, the Sabbath, how to be reconciled with a person, how to give measure for measure, how to make vows. All of those have some agreement between the two religions, Judaism and Christianity. Who are spiritual laborers? What constitutes adultery? Reproof and self-criticism, scriptures about knowing things by their fruits, concepts of salvation, concepts about being born again, concepts about judging others, and it goes on and on. There are lots of things that the two religions have some basis. All right, so this is what I wanted to get to for the last 15 minutes. We're going to talk about the Lord's Prayer next week. Whoever's teaching next week can talk about the Sermon on the Mount, but I thought we'd start with this. And so on the left side of the screen, I'm going to put up the root of the Lord's Prayer as it is written in Jewish writings, and then what we say when we say the Lord's Prayer. So for Jews, our Father who art in heaven, he identified this as being the Christian version, our Father which art in heaven. I think maybe that's the King James language, I'm not sure. Okay, so probably not too big a deal there. Exalted and hallowed be thy name from the Jewish roots. Hallowed be thy name in the Lord's Prayer. Thine is the kingdom, thy kingdom come. Are there subtle differences here, or do you think they're basically talking about the same thing?
That one's alone. Futuristic versus.
And I was wrong. Camaro was not a school, it's just the name for that.
Just the name for the writings? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for checking
This
on
is
that.
different parts of the Torah though, right? It's not like one prayer.
This is from this. He gives the
Yeah,
references
okay.
in here. I don't think all of it's necessarily from the Torah. I think some of this is from the commentaries.
Right.
In accordance with his will, thy will be done. Okay, sounds pretty close. All that is in heaven and earth is yours, in earth as it is in heaven. Feed me with the bread allotted to me. Your bread will rain from heaven. What's that referencing to? Bread raining from heaven.
Manna.
Manna. Yeah,
thank
so the Moses story in the wilderness. Give us this day our daily bread. Okay, a few more. Every creditor shall release the debt. God bestows goodness to debtors. And in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Bring us not into the grasp of temptation. The Lord will deliver us in the day of evil. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty. And from the prayer that Jesus taught, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. So I think the point in all of this is it kind of changes our perspective. Maybe it changes our perspective about some of the things that Jesus taught his disciples. I certainly, whether I was taught this intentionally or whether it was just my assumption based on the lessons I learned as a kid, I thought Jesus made up the Lord's Prayer. I thought that, something he just right on the spot. He said, I'm going to give this prayer to my disciples, and this will be the prayer that they can use to help them understand, what their prayer life needs to be like. What this makes me feel like is that Jesus was reciting the Lord's Prayer based on what he understood would be common knowledge to any good Jewish person. They would have heard all of these lines in some form before. And rather than being the originator of the information, he is rather the assembler of the information. He's taken all of these Jewish passages and combined them very adeptly into a single prayer that allows us to appreciate all of the concepts that are contained in that passage of Scripture. What do you all think?
That makes sense.
Did anybody, was anybody else, from their upbringing, did you feel the same way about the Lord's Prayer, like it was
Yeah,
something brand new?
yes, I thought it was something that Jesus created right there on that.
Hey, Paul,
Yes.
this is Arlene.
Hi.
This is Arlene speaking.
Yeah.
And can you go back to the previous slide?
This one?
Yeah. it occurred to me in the part that says, bring us not into the grasp of temptation, seems more to me like ours, and suffer us not to be led into temptation than to lead us not into temptation.
So where did that difference come from? Who provided that language? And
Joseph, that was Joseph.
yeah, that's in the inspired version. So that was not in
Right.
the original New Testament. That was
Right.
that was maybe commentary from Joseph Smith, that he didn't like the idea maybe of thinking that God would be the one to lead us into temptation. But if we look at the book of Job, he very clearly was partner in the events that happened to Job and trying to get him. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute, Arlene, too, that might shed some light on that.
Testing.
Sometimes I wondered if there was supposed to be a comment after us myself
And lead us,
and lead us.
not into
Not into
temptation.
temptation.
That's a good idea.
Oh, yeah.
Could be a grammatical issue. I never thought of that.
Of course, we also hear that God tests us, so.
Also, there's a matter of translation too.
Yeah.
It could be a matter of translation. All of those things certainly come into play.
It's kind of Jesus putting everything together is kind of showing the Jewish people, look, I'm the ultimate rabbi. I can grab all of these different prayers from different areas and put it together and show you, this is how you should pray.
Yeah,
He knows it enough that he can pull those pieces without really thinking about it.
right, and I think you're right. I think he's demonstrating a tremendous knowledge of his tradition,
Yeah.
and of the scriptures. So, that I don't know. Some people have postulated that people in those days were pretty illiterate, and maybe Jesus was illiterate as well. But based on that, he sounds like a very well-read and knowledgeable person.
Well, you can be literate, but be focused on oral tradition.
Yeah,
Be able
that's
to
true.
read and understand and not be able to write.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that distracts from what Jesus brought. The fact that he comes out of his own tradition and basically opens it up to a broader cultural tradition. I mean, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think the miracle there is that he, like I said, he drew from all of these different references that the author notes and put them into a single. I mean, I love tables. If somebody's writing about a difficult concept for me to understand, and they can put it in table form and say, here's the essence of what you need to know about this problem or this issue. And I think Jesus kind of did that for his followers. Maybe they were the illiterate ones, and he said, okay, maybe you don't know all of this, but here it is in one place for you.
I was going to say he demonstrated over and over again his knowledge of the law.
Mhm.
I mean, the greatest commandment is basically the Shema,
Mhm.
which is a prayer that observant Jews say twice a day, because you're supposed to say it on rising up and laying down.
So yeah, I think, they call Jesus Rabbi. I think he demonstrates right there why he was a rabbi.
Yeah.
All right, so the author talks a little bit about the interpretation of the Lord's Prayer. We've all probably heard a sermon or two on this in our lifetimes. The Our Father, he says, this is the community praying together. It's not just a personal prayer. This is a prayer of the community, which is something greater than the individual. And I think in Judaism, their sense of community is probably greater than ours is in some respects. Hallowed be thy name. Hallowed means holy, separate, sacred, sanctified, praised, set apart, honored. All of those are acceptable definitions for hallowed be thy name. May you continue establishing your kingdom is not just a spiritual kingdom apart from the physical world, but it's an ongoing process. We affirm that it's part of God's will and we're accomplices to the divine. In Judaism, I know the kingdom is seen as a broken place that the people are working hand in hand with God to repair and to make perfect again.
Here and now.
And if we're working to make the kingdom whole again, which would be God's will, then we are doing the will of God. From the Mishnah, Rabbi Judah taught, "Do His will as if it were your will, so that he will do His will as it were yours." Think about this. Let me say that again. Do His will as if it were your will, so that He will do His will as it were yours. So that's an interesting thought. That means if we're the ones who need to be in alignment with God. And when we find ourselves in alignment with God's will, then anything that we will is of God. I think is what the rabbi is saying here. Does that make some sense?
Well, I think it also says when alignment, then he will keep his promises.
Yeah.
Just another way to say it.
I agree with that, but I think it sort of says to me that when we're in alignment, then we're claiming the promises that have already been given. Does that make sense? I see a subtle difference there, maybe in our understanding about that. If you're on the right road, you're not on the wrong road. Already. Doesn't mean that because you're on the right road, it becomes the right road, or that God will turn it into the right road. It already is the right road. That's my thought there. All right, give us this day our daily bread, petitioning God to satisfy the needs of ourselves, our families, our communities. The image of daily bread is emblematic of all daily needs, not just food and sustenance. By the 1st century, this would be the time when Jesus lived, for Jews, daily bread was a symbol of salvation, which paralleled and then took the place of the Paschal Lamb, the symbol of God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt. There's a reference in Proverbs to daily bread as the food that is needful to me. And as I pondered this a little bit, especially that first part there about the Jews evolving in their thinking about daily bread as a symbol of salvation, taking the place of the Paschal Lamb, it opened up to me some really meaningful thoughts about what we're going to do today, which is the communion service, the Last Supper, and celebrating that. I would not have guessed that important part of Christianity would be as related to Judaism as it is. I guess I was kind of happy to hear that in a way. Anybody else for whom that seems meaningful?
Well, I was going to say, when you think that they were under Roman occupation that time, me, that's kind of referring to leaving Egypt, dictatorship down there. This is kind of revolutionary, really, and we domesticated pretty much in Christian prayer life.
Well, it's, if you go back and read, I forget which book of Paul's, I think it's in Corinthians, where he talks about the Last Supper and Jesus talking about, this is my body that's given for you and my blood that is shed for you. And then kind of line it up with that imagery of the Paschal Lamb and salvation. All of those things seem to be fitting together as we think about that this morning. All right, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. We ask to be forgiven, and that it is granted measure for measure as we are willing to forgive others. In Judaism, the belief is that God has embedded laws of reciprocity and balance in nature. These are both spiritual and physical laws, such as Newton's laws. The principle that actions or interactions between entities, whether organisms or physical forces, tend to be mutually beneficial. And so there is a lot, I think, in Judaism of this balance in terms of forgiveness and caring for one another that I don't know. I feel it's there. Maybe you don't. What do you think?
It reminds me of, I'm not a physics expert, but isn't there a law that says for every action, there's a reaction?
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so
Opposite equal.
opposite and equal.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. Like,
Mhm.
But again, that, part of that debt stuff referred to me ties to Jubilee. Again,
Mhm.
and that day and time would be kind of relevant.
Yeah.
With Roman occupation.
And one of the rabbis in the Talmud said, the way one measures others, so shall he be measured. Which sounds kind of similar in concept there.
Well, that's different than eye for an eye. That's better. When you said that earlier, I thought eye for an eye is very different in Judaism versus what Jesus.
Well, it reflects the reciprocity, but I think there's a higher level that Jesus called his followers to. And I think that higher level is there in Judaism. It just wasn't being practiced maybe at the time. And that's,
Yeah.
that was kind of what his mission was to call them back to this greater understanding of how God wanted them to behave toward each other. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. So this was, somebody made the remark earlier, a couple of remarks earlier about temptation. Lead us not to where we tested is the meaning here. That implies, according to the author, that if we are led into temptation, there's a way back. It's never the final word. The Hebrew word for evil literally means trouble. And so when we ask the Lord to deliver us from evil, we're actually asking us for the Lord to deliver us from our troubles. Psalm 41:1, the Lord delivers them in the day of trouble. And Jesus' statement in the Lord's Prayer, according to our author, reflects that same understanding about evil. And then finally, acknowledging God as the sole source of power and glory, to whom we can pray and in whom we have faith. Okay. And then in conclusion, Jesus reflects once again on reciprocity and forgiveness. He presents it both in the positive and the negative forms. If you forgive others, you will be forgiven. If you do not forgive others, you won't be forgiven either. And from the Talmud, he who waives his right to retribution is forgiven all his sins. Whose sin does God forgive? The one who forgives transgressions. Also applicable when we take the communion, because we're told, right, to not come to the altar if we have something against another person, but to first go and make amends and then come back to the altar. From the Midrash, if you withhold mercy, so the Holy One will withhold mercy from you.
Which kind of reminds me of the parable about the servant who owed money and he requested mercy and was given it, but then threatened the person who owed him money and he did not forgive him. So then the original person threw him into prison.
Yeah, and that was the parable of Jesus, right?
Yeah.
All right, well, we got through everything I'd hoped we would today. We sort of zipped through it, and I apologize. Next week, we'll continue talking about the Beatitudes, and then you can start reading in chapter 3, which is called the Two Torahs.